The outer verge was a place of silence, the kind that clawed at the mind, gnawed at the senses. Commander Elias Voss had spent too much time in the void to be rattled by the absence of sound. Yet something about this silence was different. It pressed against him like a presence, an unseen force watching, waiting. He stood at the viewport of his salvage vessel, the Solstice, staring at the anomaly before him, the ship that shouldn't exist. Official records claimed it had been lost, 40 years ago, swallowed by deep space, a casualty of some unknown catastrophe. Yet here it was, drifting in the abyss, pristine and intact, as if it had merely paused for a breath. No distress beacon, no signs of life, and, most disturbingly, no detectable power signature. It was impossible for a ship to remain operational without a reactor core, and yet the Tempest loomed before him, black and silent against the eternal night. Voss ran a gloved hand over the console, flipping through sensor scans. Every reading came back the same. Nothing. No crew, no artificial intelligence, no electronic footprint. But there was something else, a transmission. A faint, broken signal barely distinguishable from cosmic background noise. It shouldn't have been possible. And yet, beneath the static, beneath the distortion, he heard it. A voice. It was whispering his name. A chill crawled down his spine. His grip on the console tightened. He had experienced plenty of strange phenomena in deep space, rogue AIs, spatial anomalies, derelict ships with flickering emergency beacons. But this was something different. This was unnatural. His instincts screamed at him to leave. Every protocol dictated that he should mark the coordinates and report the find to command. But command didn't send him out here for protocols. They sent him for results. With a heavy breath, he activated his grappling tether, locking onto the Tempest's hull. The docking clamps engaged with a dull clang, vibrations reverberating through his ship. The airlock hissed as he stepped into the umbilical tube, his boots thudding against metal. The glow of his suit's visor flickered against the surface of the ancient vessel. Then, for the first time, the Shadow Tempest responded. The airlock door slid open. No power signature, no AI, no crew. And yet, it had opened for him. Voss hesitated, fingers hovering over his sidearm. His pulse drummed against his ribs. He should have turned back. He should have called for backup. But the voice was still there, barely audible over the crackle of his comms. It was distant, fragmented, but unmistakably human. And worse, it sounded like someone he knew. Stepping forward, he crossed the threshold into the unknown. Inside, the ship was pristine. No dust, no decay, no signs of a crew long gone. The walls were smooth black metal that absorbed the dim glow of his helmet light. Screens lined the corridor, blank and lifeless, yet they felt watchful. He moved carefully, boots silent against the polished floor. The silence pressed against him, growing heavier with every step. His fingers brushed against the walls, feeling an eerie warmth beneath the surface, like the ship itself was breathing. Then the whisper returned. Elias. He froze. The voice was clearer now, threading through the static, a ghostly remnant of something lost but not forgotten. He swallowed hard, scanning the empty corridor. His heart pounded as recognition settled over him like frost. He knew that voice. It belonged to Lieutenant Dana Kessler. His breath came in sharp, ragged pulls. His mind raced, searching for explanations. Audio loops, some kind of recording, a residual echo in the ship's failing systems. But nothing fit. The Shadow. Tempest had no AI, no operational memory banks, and yet her voice reached out to him, laced with something almost desperate. Elias, why did you leave us? The words slammed into him like a physical blow. His vision swam as old wounds reopened, bleeding regret, guilt, loss. That mission, that damned, cursed mission, the one where he lost them all. The one where he was the only survivor. The air grew thick, pressing against him like an unseen force. His suit's oxygen levels flickered, readings fluctuating wildly. His HUD glitched, distorting the hallway ahead. The ship was reacting to him. No, not the ship. Something inside it. Gritting his teeth, he pressed forward, gripping his sidearm tighter. His breathing steadied, his soldier's instincts pushing back the rising panic. If this was a trap, he would face it head-on. The corridor stretched ahead, an abyss of shadows and unanswered questions. But one thing was certain. The darkness inside the Shadow Tempest was not the absence of light, but something deeper, an oppressive void that seemed to stretch beyond space and time. Elias Voss moved forward, his pulse hammering against his ribs, each step carrying him further into the unknown. The whispers had ceased, but the weight of their presence lingered in the stale, unmoving air. His helmet's display flickered, struggling to maintain a stable readout. Sensors failed to map the ship's interior properly, the corridors twisting into configurations that defied logic. The layout didn't match any known schematics, as if the ship itself was shifting, molding its shape in response to his presence. He reached for his communicator. "Solstice, do you copy?" Static. Voss gritted his teeth. Protocol dictated that if communication was lost, he should return to his ship immediately. But something about the Shadow Tempest refused to let him leave. It wasn't just the whisper of lost voices, the distortion of time, or the eerie warmth that pulsed through the walls like a heartbeat. It was the overwhelming certainty that if he turned back now, he would never learn the truth. Ahead, a door hissed open on its own. Beyond it, the control room stretched into an unnatural vastness, far larger than the ship's exterior should allow. It was impossible, and yet, there it was. Holographic displays flickered to life, revealing fragmented images of people, faces Voss recognized, his old crew. They stood there, smiling, frozen in time. A cold sweat broke over his skin. They had all died on the Vanguard, a doomed deep space station lost 5 years ago in an incident that still haunted him. His mind rebelled against what he saw, but the ship didn't care for his disbelief. The projections shimmered, shifting through past moments, memories he had buried deep. And then, one of the figures moved. Lieutenant Dana Kessler turned her head, her eyes locking onto his. "You left us." Voss staggered back, his boots skidding against the polished floor. This wasn't real. It couldn't be real. The room darkened, the walls breathing, contracting. A deep vibration shuddered through the ship. His suit's oxygen readout spiked, levels fluctuating wildly. The Shadow Tempest was reacting to him, or something inside it was. He gripped his weapon, but what good would it do against ghosts? Against something that wore the face of his past? The whisper returned, but this time it was everywhere. "You were always meant to return, Elias." And in that moment he realized, this ship remembered him. The ship was alive, not in the way of artificial intelligence or biological consciousness, but something far older, far stranger. It did not think. It did not act. It remembered. Voss steadied his breathing, forcing down the rising tide of panic. The image of Dana Kessler, or whatever the Shadow Tempest had pulled from his past, still lingered before him. Her form flickered, caught between clarity and distortion, as if trapped in an endless loop of static. "You left us," she repeated, her voice laced with something not quite human. His mind screamed against the impossibility of it all. He had watched her die, watched them all die. There was no saving them, no coming back. And yet here she stood, staring at him with accusatory eyes, as if his survival had been a betrayal. "This isn't real," he muttered, gripping his sidearm. "You're not real." The ship disagreed. The walls shuddered, pulses of dark light rippling through the metallic surfaces like veins illuminated by unseen energy. The holographic displays twisted, the smiling faces of his old crew warping into something grotesque, contorted with grief, pain, blame. The ship had no AI, no crew, so how was it doing this? He moved fast, shoving past the flickering images, trying to reach the navigation console. His gloved fingers danced over the controls, but the system refused him. No response. No data. as though the ship itself had no past, only the ghosts it carried. Then, the voices returned. More of them. They whispered from the walls, from the floors, from the very air around him. Some wept, some screamed. Others laughed, their tones hollow and distorted. You were always meant to return. Why did you survive when we didn't? Stay, Elias. Stay with us. He clenched his jaw, his grip on reality slipping. The ship wasn't just remembering him, it was making him remember. The Vanguard. 5 years ago. The emergency alarms. The fire. The vacuum breach that had torn his crew from the station, sending them into the void while he was trapped behind a sealed bulkhead, helpless to do anything but watch. Their faces, their hands clawing at the reinforced glass, their screams silenced in the nothingness of space, and now somehow their voices had followed him here. No, he growled, shaking the memories off. You're not real. You're not them. The voices merged into one, low and resonant, vibrating through his bones. Then why do you remember us? The ship lurched beneath his feet. The gravity plating flickered, throwing him into momentary weightlessness before slamming him back down. Sparks danced along the walls as the ship's unseen system surged with unnatural energy. And then, the doors began to close. Voss lunged, barely making it through before the corridor behind him was swallowed in darkness. He sprinted down the passageway, oxygen alarms blaring, in his helmet as the ship drained power from his suit, feeding on him like a parasite. The way back was gone. His only way out was forward, and the Shadow Tempest was leading him somewhere. Somewhere it had always meant for him to go. The corridors twisted around him like a living thing, shifting and elongating as if the ship itself was breathing. Every step Voss took felt like moving against an unseen current, the air thick with an oppressive weight. His suit's oxygen levels were dropping, faster than they should be. The ship was feeding on him. No, not feeding. Learning. It was testing. Him, pulling at his mind, unearthing every buried scar, every regret he had locked away. The voices grew louder, overlapping in a chaotic symphony of sorrow and rage. His crew, his failures, the ghosts of the Vanguard haunting every inch of this place. And yet, beneath the horror, beneath the weight of grief, it was waiting for something. Voss staggered into what should have been the command bridge, but the space that greeted him was something else entirely. The ceiling stretched too high, the walls curving in ways that defied physics. A central core pulsed at the heart of the chamber, a mass of shifting black metal, its surface rippling like liquid yet solid as stone. It was alive. Not AI. Not organic. Something in between. Voss felt his breath catch as realization dawned. The ship didn't just remember him. It had been watching. Waiting. Calling. And now, it wanted an answer. The shadows coalesced around him, forming the shape of Dana Kessler. Once more, she was no longer static, no longer trapped in fragmented memory. This version of her moved with purpose, eyes filled with something deep and unfathomable. You were always meant to return, Elias, she said. This time, it was not a recording. Voss swallowed hard. What are you? She tilted her head, a slow, unnatural movement. You already know. His pulse pounded. The Shadow Tempest wasn't just a ship. It was a construct of something beyond human comprehension. A machine, a living archive, a vessel of memory itself, and it had been abandoned. Alone. Floating for decades, lost and forgotten until it found something it recognized. Until it found him. The distress call, he muttered, piecing it together. It wasn't a call for help. It was a call for me. Dana, or what was using her face, nodded. You carry them all, Elias. Every lost soul, every regret, every failure. You are made of them. The ship didn't want to consume him. It wanted to become him. Panic surged in his chest. No, he said, shaking his head. I'm not staying. I'm not one of them. The shadows pulsed, the ship's voice shifting into a chorus of whispers. You were the only one who survived. But you don't have to be alone anymore. The walls tightened, the air thickening as his body grew heavier. The ship was pulling him into its memory, trying to absorb him, to make him a part of itself. He fought against the weight, his fingers scrambling for his last remaining tool, a plasma charge. One last resort, a failsafe he carried for situations just like this. The voices screamed as he activated it, the core's pulsating surface writhing as it sensed what was coming. "You don't have to fight," Dana whispered, stepping closer. "You don't have to be alone." Voss's hands shook. For a fraction of a second he hesitated, but he was still human. And humans? They didn't belong to the past. With a roar, he threw the charge into the core and bolted. The ship howled, the very walls vibrating with a soundless scream. He sprinted through the shifting corridors as the pulse of the detonation surged behind him. The ship twisted, fought to hold him, to keep him. But he was faster. With a final lunge, he dove through the airlock as his suit's systems rebooted, restoring power. The Solstice's auto-recall function kicked in, yanking him away as the Shadow Tempest began to collapse in on itself. The last thing he heard before the comms cut out, "You will come back, Elias." Then silence, and the ship was gone. The Solstice drifted in the emptiness, its engines silent as Elias Voss sat in the cockpit, staring at the space where the Shadow Tempest had once been. The void was calm again, undisturbed by the whispers that had clawed at his mind, the ship that had tried to claim him. But the silence felt different now. He felt different. His hands trembled as he removed his helmet, oxygen rushing into his lungs in ragged gasps. The weight of survival pressed down on him heavier than ever before. He had escaped. He had won. So why did it feel like something was missing? The ship was gone, obliterated in its final moments, but he couldn't shake the feeling that it hadn't truly died, that something of it still lingered, somewhere. His fingers hovered over the ship's log recorder, hesitating. How could he even begin to explain what had happened? That a ship with no AI, no crew had spoken to him, that it had known him, that it had tried to keep him. Command wouldn't believe him. They would think stress, exhaustion, trauma had warped his perception. And maybe they wouldn't be entirely wrong. He should have been relieved. He should have been grateful. But all he could hear was the final whisper, echoing in his skull. "You will. Come back, Elias." His breath hitched. What if it was right? What if the Shadow Tempest had never been truly lost? Only waiting. A new notification flashed across his console, pulling him from his spiraling thoughts. The Solstice's sensors had finished their final scan of the anomaly's coordinates. The data was fragmented, distorted by the gravitational collapse caused by the explosion. But there was something there. Something wrong. His pulse spiked as the decrypted fragments scrolled across the screen. A distress beacon. Faint, weak, but active. And attached to it, a voice transmission. A single phrase looped over and over again. His own voice. "You were always meant to return." Voss's stomach turned to ice. His hands hovered over the controls, his mind screaming at him to leave it alone. But his fingers moved on their own. He played the transmission, and across the silence of deep space the whisper returned, soft, familiar, waiting. "Welcome back, Elias." The stars stretched endlessly before him, cold and indifferent, yet Elias Voss no longer felt like the only presence in the void. The distress beacon continued its quiet, looping chant, his own voice, repeating words he had never spoken. It was impossible. The Shadow Tempest had been destroyed, consumed by the detonation. And yet, here it was, whispering to him from the black. His fingers hovered over the command panel. Protocol dictated he should report this, flag it for investigation, let someone else deal with it. But he already knew what would happen. Command would dismiss it as interference, a glitch in deep space telemetry. The bureaucrats would scan the anomaly, find nothing and move on. The mystery would remain buried, another inexplicable ghost lost in the abyss. Except it wasn't lost. It was calling him. Voss leaned back in his seat, exhaling slowly, forcing the tremor from his hands. The rational part of him screamed to set a course back to human space, to leave this cursed place behind and never look back. He had fought too hard to escape. He had survived. But the whispers still echoed in his mind. You were always meant to return. The Solstice's systems flickered, just for a second, a faint surge through the controls, almost like a heartbeat. His ship's AI registered no anomalies, but he knew better. Something had followed him. Something had never let him leave. His gaze lingered on the distress beacon's coordinates. Another salvage crew would come eventually. They would hear the whispers. They would be tested, or maybe, just maybe, the Shadow Tempest was only waiting for him. Voss exhaled sharply, locking in a course. He should leave. He should abandon this place. Let the past remain buried where it belonged. But his hand didn't move from the throttle, and the whispers in the dark were so patient. Outside the viewport, the void seemed to shift. A shadow flickered against the distant stars, just for a moment, almost like a ship, drifting, at the edge of perception, waiting. He swallowed hard. Then with a final breath he reached for the controls and turned the ship around.